Hello, I'm Stefan Graeber, I'm the project leader for LXD, and in this one, I'd like to do a quick update on what you can expect coming from the LXD team at Canonical over the next 6 months. As you may be aware, all of our planning within the company tends to align with Ubuntu releases. So even though we release LXD monthly, we do the planning as far as features and stuff that we like to do within the Canonical team over a 6 months period. So we just all came back from 2 weeks of meetings in Prague. And as part of that was going through and presenting our roadmap to other teams, making sure it makes sense to everyone before we start working on those items. Now that we've done all that, I can go through some of the highlights of what you can expect to see over the next 6 months. So effectively up until late October 2023. So starting with LXD itself, there are quite a few things we're looking at, mostly to really make it easier for users coming from other platforms onto LXD, and especially with the initiatives like microcloud that we've been starting recently. So one pretty big thing is going to be storage. So we're looking at adding at least one new storage driver. It's going to be a bit of an extension on top of the LVM one we have, to work within clustered environments. The idea here is that if you've got a dedicated array or a large iSCSI LUN or something like that, you can expose that to all of the systems in the cluster, you'll be able to effectively use it as a remote storage pool within LXD, which will let you easily migrate instances from one machine to another, effectively treating it in much the same way as you would get feature-wise from Ceph, but instead using something like a multi-path fiber channel SAN or a remote iSCSI target or something like that as your storage. We also want to make it much easier to use LXD from a variety of tools. There are great providers currently in both Ansible and Terraform to drive LXD. Those were developed by community members over the past few years, and they work really well for what's currently covered, but they don't go and cover every single LXD feature. So we want to do a full review of those, see what might need to be added, what might need to be tweaked, so that it supports all of the different ways to interact with LXD, so that they support both containers and virtual machines alike, and so more advanced features around like networking, oven, that kind of stuff is all also supported in those tools. We've been working for a little bit now on a feature called Deployments API in LXD, which effectively will offer some of the cloud primitives around instance templates and auto-scaling, but in a way that we feel is going to be a lot more flexible and might also make a lot more sense in many scenarios. So we've done some initial work over the past 6 months. We actually have a draft pull request open and a draft spec on that right now, and we're going to be doing more work towards that this cycle. We've also added OpenID Connect authentication the past cycle, and so for this cycle we're looking at doing authorization as well. The current option that we're looking at is OpenFGA for fine-grained authorization, and that should let us, as the name implies, provide very fine-grained authorization control across the entire LXD API, with OIDC providing the identity side of it. Now, still looking at moving kind of workloads into LXD, we're looking at supporting CSM within EDK2. So for those not familiar with all of that, EDK2 is the UEFI firmware that we're using for LXD virtual machines. CSM is a compatibility mode in UEFI that lets you boot from traditional non-EFI systems. So the idea with that is if we can make this all work, and there's been some difficulty around it, it should let you migrate a VM that is not EFI capable onto LXD and still start it up just fine. So that's something that should help migration from other platforms quite a bit, but there's some difficulty there with getting EDK2 to behave. We're going to be adding an API to make it easy to extract everything that LXD knows about IP addresses. So if you're using something like Netbox or another external IPAM, you'll be able to integrate with LXD pretty easily. We won't be doing direct integration with external IPAM, but we'll provide an API that makes it easy to extract all the information and then push that through whatever IPAM API you might have. IPAM is IP address management. IP address management. So an external tool that keeps track of inventory of IP addresses, subnets, and other resources. Then on the Oven side, we've got the Oven ACL logs right now in LXD that you can query through the APIs to see if a firewall rule has hit effectively. But that's currently just kept locally, and we want to now start streaming that over to Loki as well. So if LXD is configured to use Loki for central log management, those network firewall events will also make it there. Still on the Loki front, we want to modify our Grafana dashboard to also include some amount of Loki related data in there, so that if you get both Prometheus and Loki deployed, you'll be able to get your logs integrated within the dashboard. Still, to try and make it easier for people to move over from other platforms, we're going to be adding support for uploading ISO images to LXD. So effectively, kind of as a custom storage volume. And once it's uploaded there, you can then attach it as a read-only disk to VMs that you can then start from that disk. That should make it very easy to upload, say, an ISO image as it's generated by Distro Builder for Windows, upload that to LXD, and then create an empty VM and start it from there so that you go through the installation process. LXD is obviously works a lot better when everything is image-based and you just instantly create new instances from a pre-made image, but there are cases where you can't have such an image, and your only way to build one in the first place is to go through an install process. So that's going to make that a lot easier. Still kind of on the EFI front, currently LXD supports turning on Secure Boot or not, and that's done by using multiple versions of some UEFI variable blobs that we just switch between one to another. That's not super flexible, because when we do it, that effectively flushes everything that you might have changed in the firmware configs of the VM. So we want to look at a new tool called Vert Firmware, which is a Python tool that makes it possible to directly go and edit the firmware configuration without having to wipe it clean. So that seems quite interesting. Looking forward to looking into that. More stuff on LXD. So we're looking at adding some APIs to make it very easy to move clusters, custom storage volumes within a cluster from one machine to another. Currently, that's done the same way you would between two non-clustered machines. So that's a bit slow and wasteful and takes a lot of work from the command line tool to do it. For instances, we already have a cluster-specific API that makes it a breeze effectively, and want to use the exact same API for storage volumes. We also want to make it possible to set some amount of storage volume configuration as part of the disk device for the instance. One of the ideas there being is effectively being able to set the ZFS block mode on for a specific disk without having to flip it on for the entire pool temporarily. So that should make it a bit easier. It should also work for other flags, things like ZFS ref quotas on LVM and on Ceph to let you specify a specific block file system, for example. So we've had that in the back of our minds for a while. I think it's time to do it. So we're going to be looking into doing that this cycle. We also have a bunch of work related to documentation that I'll get to quickly. One last item that's not related to documentation here is instance rebuild. So the idea there is that you might have an instance with a bunch of configuration, snapshots, all of that kind of stuff, and you just want to effectively wipe it clean and put a new image on it, but not lose all the config and anything else that's associated with the instance. So it's going to be the rebuild command, which will make it possible to just say, okay, this existing instance, just wipe it and reset it to this particular image, but don't touch its config, don't touch its devices, don't touch any of that kind of stuff. And now on the doc side, so we're looking at automating a bunch of the documentation, specifically everything around the config keys. LXD has a lot of config keys and a lot of different objects. And currently we've got code for each of those that does validation. And then we've got documentation for each of those that explains what they are and what the default values are. The risk there is that we sometimes get out of sync between the two, and sometimes we also forget to put a new key in documentation. Similarly, the bash completion profile is also manually edited right now, which also gets out of date very regularly. So the idea is to move effectively all of the documentation strings and all that stuff for the config keys into code commands, right above where we do the actual definition of the config key, and then have logic that will extract all that data and make it available to the documentation tool we're using. The exact same data could also then generate the bash completion profile, making it so that it's effectively impossible to have anything get out of sync ever again. On the doc side, there's still some navigation improvements that we're doing right now. There's a few more pages that need to be split up and reorganized, but we're getting very close to the final doc structure. So at the end of this cycle, we should be pretty much where we want. We're going to be adding two new main things to the documentation this cycle. So there's going to be API instructions, as in alongside some of the examples we have for the CLI, also show you how to do it through the API. And also instructions for how to use the newly announced LXD UI. And we will also have effectively LXD ship its own documentation. So if you use the LXD UI, which is provided by LXD itself, you will also have a different endpoint on the same API that will let you access documentation, making it very easy to have the UI linked to the docs and not even need to go on the internet for that. On the low-level side, so we have always done some kernel work and some lower-level work around LXD as well. So that's mostly work that we do in C. We have quite a bit of kernel work we're looking at doing this cycle. So a couple of them are related to us wanting to get rid of ShiftFS, which is the current shifting file system we use in conjunction with LXD to make instant startup much faster. To make that work, we need to both make sure that CFFS supports VFS ID map and ZFS also supports VFS ID map. The ZFS side has been upstreamed. We've actually tested it already. It's working fine. The Ceph side, we're actively working on fixing some issues so that can go in the upstream kernel. Once that's done, it will make it possible for Ubuntu to remove ShiftFS from the Ubuntu kernel, and LXD will then just use VFS ID map for everything, which will be a much better user experience, will get us rid of a bunch of weird bugs that we've been hitting over the years. Now, we have some work we've been defining and kind of thinking about for a while has been a new way to do user namespaces, which we call isolated user namespaces for now. It's effectively making it very easy for anyone to create user namespaces with the entirety of the UID and GID range available. So that's quite different from your normal user namespace, but will be a lot more flexible, a lot less likely to have conflicts and really avoid a lot of issues. There's some interesting complexity with designing that and getting it into the mainline kernel. So we're looking at doing a proof of concept for it effectively this cycle that we can present at the kernel summit towards the end of the year. And if there's sufficient buy-in at that point, then we'll try and start upstreaming that over the next year or so. There are also some gaps within C groups that have been kind of causing issues on the LXD side for a little while. Specifically, the net prio C group under C group v1 doesn't really exist under C group v2, so we need to figure out either how to port it in the kernel or what can we do on the LXD side that would be equivalent. Some piece of work we've done over the past few months that we want to get through the finish line now is support for handling crashes within Fuse-based daemons in the Linux kernel, which will let us handle crashes in LXCFS in a much better way. The idea with that being, if LXCFS crashes for some reason, then instead of all of the containers needing to be restarted, which is the current status of things and always a bit annoying, we'll be able to just restart LXCFS and it will reattach to its existing mounts and just keep serving things just fine. That will also allow us to do a full upgrade of LXCFS instead of kind of the half upgrade we're doing right now, where we just reload the library on package updates. That would be a lot nicer. So we're really hoping this kind of feature makes it and that we can start using it there. We're also looking at improving the way we handle make node interception in containers, because that's always been a bit tricky. effectively in some environments, when we intercept make node instead of a container, our only option to provide the requested device node is to create an empty file and bind mount the correct device on top of it. That works, but it does not persist. So if you restart the container, things are gonna break, and that's not always ideal. Thankfully, the feature is mostly used by people building images, and so they don't actually need it to persist. But it's still something that's been bothering us for a while, and we're looking at ways in the kernel or with some weird user space hacks to get this to work in a much more reliable way. And lastly, we're also looking at like reviewing and pushing again some patches around namespacing the kernel core pattern. That effectively means being able to directly run something like the systemd crash handler or Ubuntu's apport directly inside of a container, and being able to directly catch the program crashes and be able to process those crashes directly inside of the container. Now, onto the LXD UI. So there are a few things we're looking at doing there. It's not the LXD team directly working on that. It's a separate team at Canonical that does effectively all of the web development as well as the user experience work. But given that it's so tied to LXD, I figured I would go through this here too. So the main thing is we wanted to work with clustering. The main driver for that being microcloud. We wanted to have the UI just work on top of microcloud. In similar vein, we wanted to integrate with both OpenID Connect and the upcoming authorization framework that we're using, so that in a shared environment, you can have effectively the UI work properly, just show what you've got access to and let you interact with LXD normally that way. We also want to do the UI side of the ISO work I mentioned earlier in LXD, so that once we have the feature in LXD, the UI should make it possible to just select an ISO file on your system and upload it to LXD, so you can then create a VM immediately from that. We've got some work lined up as well on the networking side to let you create some basic networks, both on Oven and on normal managed bridges. That's going to be quite useful as well. And there's some user research also going on to just make sure that the design makes sense and that it's that people coming from other platforms or new users entirely find things easily. Then onto microcloud, and that's the last piece really to cover here. For microcloud, we've got quite a bit of documentation updates we need to do, mostly because that's effectively a new product with a new website. So we want to make it easy for people to get started and follow instructions. The big piece really for us this cycle is going to be the addition of Kubernetes support in microcloud. So that effectively means the microcloud command, other than setting up LXD, micro oven and micro ceph for you, it will also let you deploy micro-K8s clusters, which they're going to be running inside of LXD VMs on top of the microcloud. So that's just to make things a lot easier for the user. So you can just say, I want a micro-K8s cluster of say 5 VMs, and microcloud will talk to LXD to create those virtual machines, deploy micro-K8s in there, get the cluster up and running, and then make it easy for you to get the credentials you need to access with something like kubectl. Making it easier to deploy microcloud for users that are currently using, say, a big MAS estate with like hundreds of servers. Those folks might be using Juju to make it easy to deploy workloads on top of their MAS deployment. And for that, we're going to be creating a charm for microcloud so that you can effectively Juju deploy microcloud against MAS, saying I want a 6-machine microcloud, and it will just go and pick 6 machines, deploy it on there, and then you're going to have a working microcloud on there. Storage-wise, we want to add support for CephFS so that you can not only get RBD volumes, so like block volumes for your instances, but you can also do shared file systems on top of microcloud, still on Ceph. To make it easier to deploy things, we're going to be adding pre-seed support so that you can just feed a YAML file to microcloud. with things like your expected storage config, network config, and it will just go and assemble the microcloud for you. And lastly, we're also going to be adding some more config around Oven inside of the microcloud. Most of that has already been done. If you've been using microcloud as it's been released a couple of weeks back, those questions are already there in the flow. We might just need to do some tweaking around phrasing so that it's clearer for people as to what they need to provide, but it's all there. And that's it for LXD in, well, for what we've got planned for the next 6 months. So that's quite a lot of work, but thankfully we're a reasonably large team and we keep growing. So that's going to be quite exciting. This cycle should really make it a lot easier for anyone who's on, say, VMware, Proxmox, or any other platform to move over to LXD, either directly or through LXD or through the microcloud. And we're also going to try to really make I'm quite excited about the work on things like Ansible and Terraform to really make it easier for those external tools to integrate really nicely with LXD and make it easy to deploy workloads. That and all of the other items we have coming up, documentation is going to be great with all of the changes we've got lined up there. And that should make it for a very good experience for everyone. And I'm looking forward to doing the usual monthly LXD releases and live streams going over those features every month. So thanks a lot for watching. If you've got any questions around any of those items, leave them down below. I'll answer them there. Most of those are going to get specifications written over the next few months. So if you take a look at the LXD forum, you should see those specifications show up as we start working on them with a lot more details and opportunity to give some feedback at that point before any of that goes through implementation. Again, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.